Agriculture can be thought of as having had three eras. The first is best characterized as the blood, sweat, and tears era. Famine and fatigue were common, and inadequate food supplies occurred frequently. Most people were farmers, and many farms were small and operated at a subsistence level. Then is the mechanical era. The mechanical era of agriculture began with the invention of labor-saving machines. Much of the increase in farm productivity has been due to agricultural mechanization and improved technology. Finally, the third era of agriculture, the chemical era, this era boosted the production again. The chemical era really began when nitrogen fertilizer became readily available and increased production of the newly available hybrid corn. However, after 1945, when pesticides were developed and became widely available, yields continued to increase. Developed country agriculture is now in the era of extensive and intensive use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and seems to be moving rapidly toward the next era of agriculture, the era of biotechnology. So now let us explore this topic on chemical weed control. I've divided this lecture into three parts: the history, which is this lecture, the impact, and also the classification of chemical weed control. And here, these are the concepts and learning objectives of for this topic. Chemicals that are used for killing weeds or suppress the plant growth are called herbicides. The practice of killing the undesirable vegetation, that is weeds, with herbicides is called chemical weed control. The definition accepted by the Weed Science Society of America is that a herbicide is a chemical substance or cultured organism used to kill or suppress the growth of plants. So basically, herbicides created a major change in the way agriculture is practiced by substituting chemical energy for human and animal energy. Herbicides have several advantages and disadvantages, all of which should be considered prior to use. Herbicides can be classified in several useful ways, but no one way integrates all of them. Classification based on chemical structure and site or mechanism of action are common. So basically, the classification based on a chemical structure. So chemical structure, and also at the same time the mode of action. So we'll talk about this later on in this lecture. Agriculture witnessed tremendous changes through the production of organic herbicides, which came at a time when field workers were reducing and also high cost labor and also productive cost of production. Thus, farmers in advanced countries almost depended on herbicide because it made their production challenges in agriculture and relatively ignored other methods of weed control. The chemical era of agriculture developed rapidly after 1945. Yeah, after 1945. Remember, this is after the World War II. Sorry. Historians tell us of the sake of cartridge by the Roman in 146 BC. Okay, 146 BC. So this is kind of like the history of this, which they used salt on the fields to prevent crop growth. They use salt. Okay. Later, salt was used as an herbicide in England. Chemicals have been used as herbicides in agriculture for a long time. Sometimes we don't realize it, but their use was sporadic, frequently ineffective, and lacked any scientific based information or knowledge. So the use of chemical weed control started with inorganic copper salts such as the cuprum sulfate for broadleaf wheat control in cereals in Europe in around 1896. Other inorganic salts that were tested between 900 to 1930 include nitrates, okay, and borates. In 1912, sulfuric acid, okay, H2SO4, was used for selective weed control in onions and cereals. In 1932, the first organic herbicides, dinitroorthocresol, DNOC, sorry, I got DNOC, okay, was introduced. The introduction of 2,4-D in 1946 to effectively control broadleaf weeds in crop with less cost has led many agricultural companies to invest in the research to uncover new herbicides for different crops and weed species. So in the 1950, okay, triazine was introduced. In 1974, glyphosate frequently sold under brand name Roundup. Okay, for non-selective weed control. So this is for so Roundup or glyphosate, you basically introduced to control broadleaf. Not broadleaf. More on non-selective weed control. Rapid development of herbicides occurred after World War II. In 2002, in 2002, this is not after World War II. World War II ended in 1944-46. In 2002, 204 selective herbicides were listed in Herbicide Handbook, and 357 have been approved by the Weed Science Society. There are several experimental herbicides in some stage of progress toward marketability. If priority labels are considered, there may be more than 1,000 chemical and biological compounds used for pest control in the world. These are some factors that made herbicide popular among farmers. First, the less drudgery in chemical control than in cultural method of weed control. So which means that it's no hassle, not many power needed to apply chemical control instead of cultural method. Pre-emergence application make it possible to protect crop from the adverse effect of early weed competition, which means that they apply the herbicide before the crops emerge. So this is what they call as pre-emergence application. Field labor demand is lower than in manual and mechanical control. It's kind of like almost redundant with the first one. The only difference is this is means that the less drudgery in chemical control means there is no need for this kind of like straightforward using chemical control instead of cultural method. You can compare this with the previous lecture on cultural method, how tedious or how demanding to use cultural method in weed control. Basically, it's faster of using chemical control, so that's why farmers love to use it. More effective against perennial weeds than other methods of weed control. Because of the effectiveness, means that the control using chemical control, you can, once you apply, you know that the application will straight away kill or control the weed. So they are more effective. Finally, they are less likely to be adversely affected by erratic weather condition than other methods of weeding. So environmental factors usually not affect the effectiveness of the herbicides. I mentioned before about 2,4-D, but do you know that 2,4-D also used in war? Another name for 2,4-D is Agent Orange. So by now, I think you guys already get some idea what the 2,4-D is, if you know your history. Agent Orange or herbicide orange is one of the herbicides and defoliants used by the US military as part of its herbicidal warfare program. Operation Range Hand during the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1971, it was a mixture of equal part of two herbicides, 2,4,5-T, 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. In 1943, the US Department of the Army contracted the University of Chicago to study the effects of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T on cereal grains, including rice and broadleaf crops. From these studies arose the concept of using aerial application of herbicides to destroy enemy crops to disrupt their food supply. During the Vietnam War between 1962 and 1971, the United States military sprayed nearly 20 million US gallons. There's around more than 75 billion liter or 75 million liter of chemical herbicides and defoliants in Vietnam, eastern Laos, and parts of Cambodia as part of the aerial defoliation program known as Operation Range Hand, reaching its peak around 1979 to 1969. Sorry, 1967 to 1969. The campaign destroyed 5 million acres of upland and mangrove forests and millions of acres of crops. Overall, more than 20% of South Vietnam's forests were sprayed at least once over a 9-year period. So about 17.8%, around 3 million hectares of the total forested area of Vietnam was sprayed during the war, which disrupted ecological equilibrium. The persistent nature of dioxins, erosion caused by loss of tree cover and loss of seedling forest stock meant by reforestation was difficult or mostly impossible in many areas. Many defoliated forest areas were quickly invaded by aggressive pioneer species such as bamboo and coconut grass, making forest regeneration difficult and unlikely. Animal species diversity was also impacted, and one study by Harvard biologists found 24 species of birds and 5 species of mammals in sprayed forests, while in two adjacent sections of unsprayed forests, there were 145 and 170 species of birds and 30 to 55 species of mammals. Dioxins from Agent Orange have persisted in the Vietnamese environment since the war, settling in the soil and sediment and entering the food chain through animals and fish which feed in the contaminated areas. The movement of dioxin through the food web has resulted in concentration and biomagnification. The areas most heavily contaminated with dioxins basically are former USA bases. So, herbicide, anyone?